temples give the greatest insight into what concerned John.
The partially reconstructed remains give us a good idea of what an impressive building this would have been. But it was actually in the courtyard around the temple where most of the activity would have taken place. There would have been sacrifice on an altar in front of the temple. The people would have gathered around, would have sung songs, would have offered prayers and vows. And then when the ceremony was over, they might have been able to take home some meat to help supplement their diet.
John was familiar with pagan worship, but this religious practice was growing in popularity and was in direct conflict with Christianity. It had begun around 100 years before Domitian with the building of temples to a new god, the Emperor Augustus.
There would have been sacrifices that took place at the imperial temple where people in the city would have gathered and participated in honoring both the presence and power of Rome and the emperor as an individual.
This idolatry spread across Asia Minor throughout the 1st century. Every city in the Roman Empire had many temples, but this was one built to worship and give thanks to a living person, an imperial god. And here may lie the key to Revelation. For John, this cult of the emperor would have been a terrible blasphemy.
John would have resisted the imperial cult because it stood against the belief in Jesus that he was so interested in promoting.
John is a Jewish Christian, and he knows there's only one true God. So he cannot, because of his upbringing, compromise in any way on that basic fact.
But the most compelling evidence that the Roman Empire, and especially the imperial cult, was John's target, comes from one of his most frightening visions, a terrifying beast who makes war against God's people. The beast, he writes, demands worship. And this gives the first clue as to what it really represents.
Worship of the imperial gods had become extremely popular, to the degree that persons who didn't participate may have been perceived as disloyal.
In this strange vision, the beast had not one head, but 7. By John's time, 7 emperors had ruled the empire.
John tells us that these are 7 kings or rulers. And though scholars can't agree on which Roman emperors these 7 heads may represent, they seem to represent Roman imperial power. John also associates the beast with 7 hills. And of course, the city of Rome was known then as it is now as the City of 7 Hills.
To many academics, these cryptic but repeated references to the beast show that John's target isn't Roman persecution, but the paganism of the imperial cult. However, that can't be the whole story. John's audience, as fellow Christians, would have shared his views, and therefore there'd have been no need to write such a letter. But a closer look at the text of Revelation reveals just why John felt it was so important to send his message. John, it seems, may have been alarmed about the behavior of some members of his flock. One such church was to be found in another part of the Roman Empire. To the south of Pergamum was the ancient city of Ephesus.
Standing on this square in the ancient city of Ephesus, it's easy to get a sense of the Ephesus that John would have known. The streets would have been full of people, the shops full of people selling their wares. This was an ancient port city where people would have come from all over the Mediterranean world and beyond to trade, to share ideas, and sometimes to share religions.
In this Mediterranean cultural melting pot, the Christian church would have been a tiny minority.
A theater like this would hold 25,000 people, and the Christian community, the churches here, would probably account for a very small percentage of that. The Christians probably would have filled up only a couple of rows.
The pressure on these communities was great, especially in a thriving pagan center like Ephesus. Pressure that could weaken the faith of a struggling church.
Their neighbors were continually celebrating the various gods who were popular in the region, as well as the imperial gods of Rome, and on occasion even the emperor himself. Symbols of the various deities would be all around them.
One of the major issues for somebody like John seems not to be the fact that they are suffering persecution, but the fact that they've just become too comfortable. They've settled down. They've found their place in society. And he's wanted to shake them up a bit.
If John was writing to those Christians who had begun to worship Rome's emperors, it would help explain why the last book of the Bible was written. The visions were less about prophesying the future and more about chastising those who had joined the imperial cult. But there is something left unanswered. The vivid apocalyptic images which have captured the imagination of millions of Christians for centuries. What possible meaning could these visions have had for John's churches? Maybe they had little to do with the cult of the divine emperor and everything to do with the visions of a terrifying future. To those who lived 2,000 years ago, John's visions of the four horsemen, Armageddon and the beast may have held entirely different meanings than today. Some see them now as signs for the end of the world, but that's not necessarily what John meant. The word apocalyptic had a different emphasis then.
Many people, when they hear the word apocalyptic, think about the end of the world. But that's only part of this great tradition.
In fact, there had been other apocalypses or revelations written in the previous 200 years. The key feature of apocalyptic literature is that it claims to reveal God's will directly. It's a message that no ordinary mortal would have access to.
They're all stories. A single human visionary has this dramatic revelatory experience, and he requires the assistance of a heavenly being to explain what he's seeing and experiencing. So the apocalypses unfold as stories describing these experiences.
Apocalypses promise their readers an escape from the harsh reality of everyday life. For first-century Christians, John's writings offer a world where their faith triumphs.
They promise their audience God's world. It's either in the heavenly realms or it's coming in the future. And it's a world where the faithful will be rewarded for their faithfulness, and where justice will prevail, and where wickedness will be judged.
John was in good company. Some scholars believe that Jesus himself was deeply influenced by apocalyptic literature. One of the most famous prayers in the world seems to share the same themes as the book of Revelation.
When the disciples of Jesus ask him to teach them how to pray, then Jesus teaches them to say the Lord's Prayer. And that prayer can be read apocalyptically. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. that implies that the kingdom of God has not yet come to earth, that the will of God is not being done on earth. So that's like the book of Revelation, seeing God and Christ exalted in heaven.
And the Lord's Prayer may even have a beast of its own.
As God's kingdom began to come, then the powers of evil would do their uttermost to battle against it. So you have beasts, you have the devil at work. And that's probably what is meant at the end of the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into the trial, but deliver us from evil, or probably deliver us from the evil one, deliver us from the power of Satan.
If Jesus used apocalyptic imagery, why not his follower John? Perhaps this tradition of apocalyptic writing can help decipher some of John's visions, like the infamous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These terrifying beings appear first in a text from the Old Testament, the book of the prophet Zechariah. But John didn't just copy these images. His genius lay in updating them for the 1st century. In Zechariah, each horse is linked with a particular color. John takes this idea, but gives it a new twist. His 1st century audience would probably have understood the meaning of the colors. Ian Boxall believes he can crack John's code.
John seems to make the significance of the colours more explicit. You have a red horse. Red's the colour of blood, and according to tradition, the colour of a kind of idolatrous luxury which has brought Rome its current dominance, but at the expense of so much blood being shed.
The rider on the black horse seems to symbolize famine and disaster, the aftermath of war. Then there is a pale or green horse, the sickly color of death itself. But one horseman described by John, the rider on the white horse, has a bow in his hand. This suggests vengeance is on John's mind, and he believes it will come at the hand of Rome's sworn enemy.
Now, your average Christian would know that the great enemy of Rome, the great threat to Rome on the east, the Parthian Empire, had a cavalry which carried bows. The Parthians are on their way, and the ultimate effect of this will be the destruction of this apparently impregnable empire.
So even the vision of the 4 horsemen is part of John's encouragement to the Christian church that the empire's days were numbered. But the 4 horsemen are not the only apocalyptic images in the book. Just as famous is Armageddon, the battlefield where Revelation says the forces of good and evil will wage war. Archaeological evidence shows that this image too is meant to evoke hatred of the Romans. This is Megiddo, in the Jezreel Valley in modern-day Israel. Archaeologists believe that its name holds a clue to the site of Armageddon.
In Hebrew, the site of Megiddo was actually Har Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo. And we go from Har Megiddo to Harmageddon to Armageddon. And indeed, in some of the earliest versions of the New Testament, written in Greek, Armageddon has an aspirant at the beginning, meaning it's pronounced with an H. So it originally was Harmageddon, and you can get from Har Megiddo to Harmageddon very easily.
This tranquil site seems an unlikely place for John to choose as the location for the battle at the end of the world. But in fact, it was entirely appropriate.
The Jezreel Valley would have been the bloodiest place in Palestine that John knew about. At the time that John is writing in the 1st century AD, there had already been 12